Hello students, welcome to part 2 of this video. We've just completed a discussion of modern-day monarchy in Saudi Arabia, though we've learned that it's not unchanging. We learned a little bit about how to measure democracy in a country by looking at the Polity 4 and Freedom House numbers for Saudi Arabia. Now we move on to consider a theocratic regime, a relatively uncommon regime type in 2015. Let's learn a little bit about Iran first. Of course, Iran was a great empire going back thousands of years. We've heard of many famous figures from Iran: Cyrus, Darius, their attempt to conquer ancient Greece. We know that Alexander the Great toppled the Persian regime in 330 BC. But the Iranians continued to grow. A famous empire called the Sasanian Empire was a major competitor with Rome and later Byzantium. In 641 AD, or CE for Common Era, Muslims conquered Iran. They brought Arab culture, language, religion, and they began to export Sasanian administrative techniques and the Persian language to Muslim domains. So Persian administration, Persian language traveled further east toward India, toward Central Asia, and the Iranians had an influence, a significant influence in the Muslim world. Under Islam, Iran was a great center of learning, poetry, gardens. In 1501, Shia Islam was established as the dominant faith in Iran. So we need to just understand a little quick aside on Shia versus Sunni Islam. Sunni Muslims represent about 90% of the world's Muslims. They believe the succession to the leadership in the Muslim community should be determined by the community of believers. They supported the way Islam passed one leader to the next in the early period after Muhammad. Those first caliphs were considered rightly guided by the by the Sunni community. The Shia, on the other hand, felt that the Muslim succession should go to Ali, who was a cousin and also a son-in-law of the Prophet. War broke out between these partisans of Ali and Hussein, his son, and both were eventually killed, and Sunnis remained the dominant faith inside Islam. However, over time, the separateness of these two communities, which went back to this leadership struggle, eventually led to theological differences too. In Shia Islam, the imams, like Khomeini, who we're going to talk about in a second, are considered to have some divine qualities. There's also a belief that a 12th imam, kind of a messianic figure, is hidden and will return. In Shia Islam also there's something called ijtihad, in which people are able to use reason to solve contemporary issues as being guided by the Quran and other Muslim ideas. Where do we find Shia Muslims today? In Iran is the largest Shia Muslim country. Southern Iraq, as we know, is a very populous Shia area. Southern Lebanon, and also in the country of Bahrain. So how was Iran ruled coming into the modern era? There was a Shah named Reza Khan Pahlavi. He consolidated his control in 1921. He was a modernizing fellow, tried to build roads, banking system, professional civil service, and modern educational institutions. He, however, was a little too independent for the likings of the people who wanted to have influence in Iran, and they saw that his son was brought to power. His name was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and that's the man we know of as the Shah of Iran. He was seen as more amenable to Western interests. Now, what we have then is a monarchical regime under the Shahs. You can see this picture here, the incredible opulence. This is the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, his wife Farah and one of their children. But you can see the opulent robes, the opulent room, the opulent jewels. All of those things contributed to the fall of this monarchy and the eventual accession of a theocratic regime. The Shah, he continued the policies of his father to force modernization in the country. People didn't like that. They found it disorienting. He forced people to westernize their dress and westernize their customs. He made enemies of Islamic figures and traditionalists. His regime was also brutal. He had a secret police organization known as the Savak, which sounds evil in and of itself, and he used violence to control opposition. As I mentioned, the opulence as well. He also irritated people through the close relations he maintained with the United States and with Israel as well. So where does Khomeini come into the story? Well, Khomeini was in Najaf. He was a Shia cleric in that city. He had made cassette tapes of his sermons, and these were kind of smuggled into Iran, and they began to excite people against the Shah. He was able to capitalize on the dissent and to capture the protest movement, because there were many people who opposed the Shah. Islamists on the right and communists on the left. The Shah tried to reform in some small ways, but eventually he was forced to flee in 1979, and we had the creation of an entirely new type of regime in the world, a modern Islamic theocratic republic, which we know as the Islamic Republic of Iran. Khomeini had written a book called Islamic Government, in which he spelled out his ideas for government, what this Islamic state would look like. The most important concept is called Velayat-i-Faqih, which means the guardianship of the jurist. What this means is basically that clerics should be the one with a dominant position in the system to assure that the government doesn't move away from religion. So, in Iran, what you get, you can see two columns here. You get kind of dual governments. You have a government on the clerical side, where you have a supreme leader. We have the successor to Ayatollah Khomeini, who's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He has a lot of powers to set general policy guidelines, supervise implementation, appoint the head of the judiciary, and to oversee the armed forces. There's also an assembly of experts. They're the ones who choose the supreme leader. There's a council of guardians, which is an Islamic court. These are clerics and lay people who interpret the Constitution, and they can conduct judicial review, and they supervise elections. So all those powers lie on the clerical side of this regime. That's why it is considered theocratic. On the other side, we have a government that we might recognize. We have a parliament, we have a president, we have a Supreme Court, we have institutions that look familiar to us. I'd ask you to try and think a little bit about why change didn't come to Iran. There was an attempt a few years ago of something called the Green Revolution. People were protesting in the streets. Why weren't they able to bring about change? Think about whether change in Iran can come from the inside. Using our framework from the Samuel's book to analyze a theocracy, this non-democratic regime, we look at the selectorate. Now, who is in the selectorate? These are the top clerics who choose the supreme leader, so the council of guardians. How do you get admitted to the selectorate? Basically, you rise in the clerical hierarchy. How do you select leaders? What are the rules? Well, in Iran, you're pretty much in for life. There's no one. Ali Khamenei, who's the supreme leader right now, is pretty much in there, barring a revolution, as long as he'd like to stay. Rules governing the use of power. There is a constitution that notionally exists, but we wonder if the supreme leader really can be checked. Let's take a look again at our polity 4 sort of map of democracy in Iran. Now remember, get to democracy here in this level, in this schema. So going back to 1945, we had a little less than democratic regime. We had, when the Shah of Iran consolidated his power, got to an extremely repressive regime. Some attempts to reform. This is now the Islamic Republic coming into existence. We have some democratization, maybe even going over into democratic territory. Then we have the slide back down in this low period, particularly during the time of President Ahmadinejad, which you might remember. If we look at the Freedom House scores, we can see, remember, 1 is very democratic, 7 is very undemocratic. So Iran rates a 6 on political rights and a 6 on civil liberties. So not very democratic indeed.